if you don't have your pumpkins ready and carved and your skeleton decorations hung up and maybe your ghosty decorations hung up, I don't know what to tell you or how to help you because it is full swing spooky season and the deadline is pretty well here. And given that it is spooky season, and Halloween certainly is a part of that, but also All Saints' Day or All Souls' Day or Day of the Dead, depending on who you are and what your traditions are. And there are many other kinds of festivals that honor the dead and pay homage to and attention to the difference between this life and what lies beyond. It seems like a good time to talk about a book that I recently read that I have not been able to stop thinking about called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory by Caitlin Doughty, I believe is how you say her last name, Doughty. And I had the good luck to stumble upon this book at the library in the staff favorites section, and I picked it up and I thought, you know what, I've got a morbid curiosity, I've got a strong history with death, what is not to like? Reading this book was really a breath of fresh air. It was unlike anything I had read before. Because of my own history with family members dying and passing away, it was really nice to hear somebody talk in a very honest, upfront, and also humorous way about everything that goes along with the process of death and dying and the things that happen to our bodies after we have passed away. A few quotes from her book that just to give you kind of a taste of Dottie's writing style. She says, "What was a nice girl like me doing in a body disposal warehouse like this? The first time I peeked on a cremating body felt outrageously transgressive. No matter how many heavy metal album covers you've seen, how many Hieronymus Bosch prints of the tortures of hell, or even the scene in Indiana Jones where the face melts off, you cannot be prepared to view a body being cremated. Seeing a flaming human skull is intense beyond your wildest flights of imagination." One can only imagine. Yes, that makes a lot of sense to me. And she also says, referencing after having finished a cremation, "I punched his name into the label maker, which hummed and spit out the identity that would be stuck on the front of his eternal holding chamber. I placed him on a shelf above the cremation desk where he joined the line of brown plastic soldiers dutifully waiting for someone to come claim them. Satisfied at having done my job and taken man from corpse to ash, I left the crematory at 5 p.m. covered in my fine layer of people dust." What? What an image. And her whole book is full of these kinds of, it's very honest and very foreign to most folks in our modern culture to have this sort of glimpse into what happens after death and cremation of remains and this sort of thing. So I was fully invested from the jump. I enjoyed this book. Apparently she has 2 other books out, which I learned as I was getting ready to record this episode or this video, and I need to now go track them down and read them because delightful. This book, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, was a New York Times bestseller, so obviously she has struck a chord, and Dottie's work at this time, I really hope I'm saying her name right, I'm so sorry if I'm not, but her work has a lot to do, she is a mortician, and she is working to, obviously, as you might be able to tell from the quotes that I read to you, she is really working to decrease the mystery and the stigma that exists around death. Maybe stigma is not the right word, but this mystery that exists of, well, someone dies and then we don't know what happens, if anything happens to the soul after the fact, but then just physically, what are the things that we're doing to manage processing bodies after death? And so she is really helping to provide information and very honest and forthright information. She also has been doing a lot of work in terms of green burial. And so rather than having folks be cremated, pushing for legislation to legalize terramation and aquamation, I think is what it's called. So either having the body be broken down by natural means via essentially composting in either the earth or in water. And there are different ways, obviously, that these things are done, and legislation does vary state to state and this sort of thing. But very interesting concepts and exciting things to be working towards, which is maybe a strange thing to say. But my own interest, of course, I think we all have some morbid curiosity about different kinds of things, but my own interest in this is from the deaths that I've experienced over the years. This is part 2 of a 2-part series I'm doing around spooky season and Halloween and all of that sort of thing. But, and if you listen to part one, you will have heard a little bit of this already. But if you haven't, my grandmother passed in the summer between 8th and ninth grade, and this was a summer that really was very interesting because I was confirmed and I was graduating from 8th grade and going into high school, and so there was an interesting splicing of my time and emotions between celebrations of these transitions that I was going through, but also the transition of the loss of my grandmother, which was very significant. And in her case, the intimacies of her death, she was in the hospital when she was sick. She had emphysema. I saw her once or twice in the hospital, and then I saw her embalmed in her casket before she was buried, and that was it. My grandfather passed mid-ninth grade, so a little less than a year later, and he ended up passing at home with hospice care, and his death was much more up close and personal because he was there in hospice care in our home. And so I was better able to witness the process of dying. And if someone is ill, this is at the same time can be a drawn out process, but also very short. And it's very strange how time stretches and the experience and the emotions color all of that and the perception of time. But rather than having a more, quote, sterile hospital process, it was not so clean. I saw in depth the process and the changes that the body goes through. And so I also had the opportunity to see as, after he passed and then they came and wheeled his body out of the house, I was able to see that happen. And then, of course, I saw him again at the viewing before we had his funeral and he was buried. And then after that, my mother's spouse passed at the beginning of my senior year of high school. So that's, 4 years, 4.5 years, and having three, my family is very small, so 3 out of 5 of us passed in that time period. And so my mom's spouse passed at the beginning of the senior year of high school, like I said, and she also was at home with hospice. And because she was my parent, her loss was probably the hardest to go through. And unfortunately, for me at that time, the process of watching somebody be sick, get diagnosed, go through some treatments, end up coming home with hospice was not a new process anymore. And so there's a lot about her death I actually don't remember. I had to really think back and do I remember her funeral? Because I think I had blocked it out. And there are some flashes here and there. I remember her viewing very well, which is interesting. But like I said, I really don't remember her funeral very well at all. I don't think I was there for her burial or her interment. For whatever reason, it may have been school or something else going on. And my mom just said, you know what, stay home. And she went. And it's strange that I don't remember, to be frank. It feels very odd. But because all of these deaths happened in that age period between 12, 13, and 17 for me, those are formative years. And so I do think about death a fair bit. And it was, for that reason, it was so, I think I said this at the beginning, but it was so refreshing to hear somebody else write about death and their own experiences with death, both personally and professionally, from this very honest, upfront perspective. Doughty shares her own personal experiences with death along with those professional ones. Like I said, it's so bizarre, the mix of business and grief and the way that life and death intermingle in our culture, because we don't often have very clear rituals or ways of going about doing this. And so it's sort of what's, financially what makes sense and logistically, and do we have to are there flights that we need to arrange and all these different kinds of things. The other thing that I really liked about this book, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, is that Doughty explains various death customs from around the world and throughout history. And certainly there is a lot of information out there about different customs throughout the world. There is one concept that I thought was very interesting. She describes webs of significance, referring to these ideas and concepts and practices and rituals that we are inculcated with in our culture, and how that makes a big difference about how we perceive these kinds of life events like birth and death, and how it's very difficult from an outside perspective to have a very clear understanding of how another culture approaches these kinds of things, because you don't have those same whims of significance. You have different ones from your own culture. And so it was very interesting for her to weave these different traditions in throughout the book. But in terms of history in the United States, I hadn't realized, I probably did know this at some point, but she talks about the fact that in the United States, folks were really dying at home up until the 1930s or so. And this was the time when hospitals really sort of came into vogue, so to speak, and, quote, removed from view all the gruesome sights, smells, and sounds of death. It is very different to die in a hospital than it is to die at home, though the process that the body goes through is very similar. Meanwhile, embalming in the USA, and I had no idea, was largely a product of the Civil War. So there's that. This was a practice that was sold and practiced as a cost-effective way to get soldiers' bodies back to their families. Because in the South in the summer, it is hot, and you can imagine there came a time when rail companies wouldn't transport bodies unless you had a very expensive kind of airtight, smell-proof coffin. And so to get these soldiers' bodies back to their families, embalming became a much wider practice. Then, fast forward into 1963, and a woman named Jessica Mitford published The American Way of Death, which is a book. And Mitford was British, I understand, if memory serves. And she was, in writing this book, Mitford was really going after the cost of the funeral industry, because embalming is expensive, and going through that whole process is very expensive. And there was a shift of folks who were doing embalming were working to legitimize themselves and to make it more of a formalized process and practice. And so in that, of course, the cost went up. And so Mitford was like, this is absurd. What are you doing? Why would you do this? And cremation is much less expensive than embalming and burial is. And so her argument was effective, and the culture shifted in response to her book, and she really got her way. The funeral industry today projects that the numbers of cremations will exceed 80% by 2035 and will be greater than 50% in each state by 2033. So that's very significant. And it's not without environmental consequence. And then it's also not without emotional or spiritual consequence either. Part of Doughtie's argument is that we really need to reacquaint ourselves with death, with the realities of it, not just this slick translation from like, oh, this person was alive, and then the next time you see them is in their urn after they have been cremated, or even embalmed. And she asserts, and I agree wholeheartedly, that, quote, a corpse doesn't need you to remember it. It doesn't need anything anymore. It is you who needs the corpse. Looking at the body, you understand that the person is gone. They are no longer an active player in the game of life. Looking at the body, you see yourself, and you know that you too will die. The visual is a call to self-awareness. It is the beginning of wisdom. If you listen to part 1, when I was talking with Georgie, we talked about this as we're thinking about death and death of our loved ones, our own deaths. Having a good sense of self-reflection and clarity is very important, and self-knowledge, and being able to have some honesty with yourself, and kind of radical honesty with yourself about how you might like that process to unfold. The other piece is that sitting with the body of someone who has passed, particularly if that person was very important to you, helps us to recognize that that person is in fact no longer here in this life. They will not be back again in that form in this lifetime. And it facilitates acceptance in a very stark and concrete way. The person, in my experience, when I went to viewings of my family members, the person almost looks like they could like sit up and start talking again. And of course they can't. And so that's very... sitting and wrestling with that and really internalizing that is an important process. The other piece is that it's not just seeing the body, but also seeing that casket closed. And there's a reason closure is called closure. We like kind of close that up and, okay, that part of life is finished now. That's the end of that. There's a really heartbreaking story. Tia Levings, I have the book somewhere. Oh, I think I put it on my shelf. It's not in reach, but Tia Levings wrote a book, memoir, A Well-Trained Life, My Escape from Christian Patriarchy. And in that book, she has a very heart-wrenching description of the loss that she experienced of her daughter, Clara, very shortly after her daughter was born. And she describes calling the midwife that she had worked with and just like not knowing kind of what to do in that moment. And the midwife told her, you need to be alone with your dead. And so the staff at the hospital gave Levings her daughter, and she sat and held her until both her father came and her ex-husband, the father of Clara, also came. It's very interesting to hear her describe sort of the settling, the heaviness of, emotionally certainly, but the literal heaviness of holding, and how that sort of helped her internalize that, yes, this loss had in fact happened. And I think that this is very important no matter what the age of the person who has passed away. We do need to be able to have some access to that for our own health and well-being. The person who's passed, they're doing whatever they're doing after this life, but we who are still living do need that access. In that quote that I just shared, Doughty shares that having access to and being present with the body of someone who has passed is the beginning of wisdom. And I'm not sure exactly how she would articulate that or what she would include in that, but I do think that there are a few things that would play into that from my perspective. One is, like I said, making peace with death. This is happening. I think it's an important part of the grief process, but also making peace with death as a normal occurrence. This is something that happens in life, is that folks die. And so being able to be present for that. And depending where you are, I'm also cognizant of the fact that depending upon where you are in the world, folks are, without their option, much more acutely aware of the fact that, yeah, death happens potentially on a daily basis. But for those of us who live in a culture that is so privileged as to not have to look at this in the face every day, it's important that we are able to practice doing that. The other piece is recognizing that our time is fleeting and acting accordingly, both in our actions and aspirations, but also in the quality of our attention to the people who we care for. So by this, I mean that knowing that we will die means that while we are here, we need to do what we need to do. And this can be very practical. Maybe folks have career aspirations or family aspirations or different things that they would like to accomplish, and you have to get underway and get moving and work towards these kinds of things. Now, this isn't to say that anybody's necessarily behind anybody else. I don't think you can look at somebody else and say, I'm behind them and so I'm slow and my timeline is off. I don't think that's the case, but it does behoove us to make good use of the time that we're given. And without a clear awareness and familiarity with death, it makes it much harder to do so. And then in terms of the quality of our attention with the people that we care for, I know for me, because I did experience these very significant losses in a very formative time in my life, I get really fussy about when people in my family are distracted when I want us to be present together. And so I know that there have been times when my husband is just like, Catherine, can you just relax and like let this go? And honestly, no, because it's so important that we're able to connect one-on-one and in groups and in our communities without distraction and without devices, and to be able to listen to each other's stories and hear from each other and have all of these kinds of important moments and even the mundane moments. And I remember my mother has written about the loss of her spouse, and something that she describes is that change that happens when somebody gets a terminal diagnosis. There are moments of life that we don't necessarily think about as being significant. Things like going for a walk or emptying the dishwasher or cleaning up the kitchen or making the bed together or, cleaning up toys at the end of the day or I don't know, insert whatever mundane daily occurrence. When someone close to us gets, or even ourselves, if somebody gets a diagnosis that is likely terminal, those moments become very important. And so having an awareness day to day on some level that, yes, my time is limited, this is transient, this will change at some point, helps us to enhance the quality of our time with the people that we are with, who we care most about, if we let it. I'm not suggesting that we need to always be in a doom and gloom space of, oh my gosh, this is going to end, and like existential crisis all the time. That's not what I'm suggesting. But there is something to be said for letting the significance of the transience of life sink in, and letting that season how we spend our days and our attention and our time. And the last thing that, maybe not the last thing, but for the time being, the last thing that I would add in here is consideration of the non-physical aspects of life. The fact of the matter is that in the United States anyway, many folks have moved away from spirituality or religion as such. And you can argue that one way or another, whether or not that's okay or not, or whether or not we need this as individuals and as a culture. But I do think that there is something lost if we're not considering non-physical in addition to physical. Mind, body, spirit. Spirit is important. And so when we are more familiar with the fact that this shift happens, at birth we're pretty familiar with it, but that takes some time and it's a little bit different because you have, from conception to birth is 9 months, give or take. And so there's this like interesting liminal time of like, what's happening before the moment of birth happens, and then birth happens, and you're like, yeah, there's a baby here, but there's been this sort of build up to that moment. Whereas with death, it just, you're here and you're not. And so that's a starkness and a quickness that is interesting to reckon with. What does that mean? What was here and what now isn't? The body's still here, but what was enlivening the body? And so that appreciation for and consideration of the fact that there is something non-physical, whatever you elect to call that, or however you relate to it, or whatever you think may happen to that after death, the fact is that there is something there that is shifting. And so I think it's important to consider that and to really wrestle with that and figure out, what do I think about that? All of that said, I highly recommend Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory by Caitlin Doughty. And if you have the time, pick it up, get it on audiobook, whatever. It is so well worth the read. And she's so funny. And I learned a lot reading her book, and it's not a long one. It's pretty short. So if you have some time, if you're looking, if you have a book, a certain number of books you're trying to read this year, make this one of them. And in the meantime, I hope that you enjoy your spooky season, and I will see you next time.